The airport was already buzzing with that peculiar blend of excitement and frustration that only travelers can muster, families juggling strollers and souvenirs, solo adventurers clutching boarding passes like lifelines, and business people glued to their screens, their eyes darting between emails and the departure board. Me? I was just trying to get to Maui without drama, a quiet seat by the window, noise-canceling headphones ready to drown out the world, and a podcast lined up to keep my mind off the memories that seemed to trail me like a persistent shadow. I had even smiled at the flight attendant when I boarded, something I hadn't done in a while, hoping maybe, just maybe, this would be the peaceful flight I needed to clear my head. I settled into my seat, 22A, tucking my small backpack beneath the seat in front of me. I adjusted my headphones and scrolled to the latest episode of that history podcast I liked. Something about lost cities and ancient betrayals that felt oddly comforting. The hum of the plane's engines was a white noise I could embrace, the low murmur of passengers a distant, insignificant buzz. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders relax. For the first time in days, I felt something close to calm. That calm didn't last long. A loud thud shattered the fragile peace as someone crashed, into the seat beside me, sending my elbow jabbing into my ribs. I pulled off my headphones and turned, about to mutter a polite, "Excuse me," that came out sounding more like a growl. Then her voice hit me like a punch in the gut, soft yet sharp, laced with that unmistakable tone I'd spent years trying to forget. Well, if it isn't Dropout Dude. The nickname slithered through the air between us like a cold blade. I turned, and there she was, Cambria, my ex-wife. Same perfectly styled hair, now highlighted in a way that probably cost more than my entire flight. Same diamond earrings, bigger than the ones I'd helped her pick out back when we were playing house in a crumbling apartment. And the same smirk she'd worn when she'd left me for greener pastures, greener bank accounts. Her perfume hit me next, some designer scent that smelled like money, like the kind of life she'd always craved and I could never afford. I tried not to inhale too deeply. It was a scent that had once meant nights tangled in bed and whispered promises. Now it meant nothing but a reminder of everything I'd lost. I tried to smile, but it felt more like a grimace. Cambria. I said her name like I was trying it on for size. It still fit, unfortunately. She leaned back, her expression a mixture of glee and disbelief. "Imagine finding you here," she said, her voice dripping with faux surprise. "Flying coach? Still living the dream, huh?" Her eyes flicked to my headphones. The podcast paused on the screen. "Got yourself a window seat, too. Cute." I turned away, focusing on the clouds beyond the glass, the tarmac slowly shrinking as the plane prepared to taxi. I thought about ignoring her, pretending she was just another passenger. But I learned the hard way that ignoring Cambria never worked. She thrived on reactions fed on them, actually. "Guess some things never change," she said, her tone suddenly sharp enough to cut steel. She leaned in, her voice lowering. "You still playing at being someone, Jalen? Or are you just another dropout with a window seat and big dreams that never took off?" I clenched my jaw, forcing my gaze to stay steady on the horizon. I'd promised myself I wouldn't let her get to me. But she always had a way of finding the soft spots, poking until they bled. "Nice to see you too, Cambria," I muttered, my tone flat but even. She laughed, a short, biting sound that made the older lady across the aisle glance over, curious. "Oh, Jalen," she said, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. "You always were so predictable. Thought you'd impress me with your charm and your half-finished degree. Look at you now, same cheap clothes, same haunted eyes." I shifted in my seat, biting down the urge to respond. I'd left that fight behind years ago. She didn't deserve the energy it would take to argue. But my silence only seemed to amuse her more. "You know, my husband would never fly coach," she continued, flicking her perfectly manicured nails like she was discarding me along with some imaginary lint. "Private jets only. We just got back from Capri, actually. Maybe you've heard of it? Italy? The Amalfi Coast? Oh, right, probably not your scene." She smiled, all teeth in venom. "But hey, at least you got the window seat. Dream big, Jalen." Her words rolled over me, heavy and thick. I wanted to tell her about the job I just lined up in Maui, about the small restaurant I'd invested in with my friend Bob, about how I'd finally found some peace in a life that no longer had her in it. But I knew better. Cambria didn't want to hear about my successes. She wanted to see me small, and I wouldn't give her that satisfaction. So I did what I learned to do when the world threw me curveballs. I put my headphones back on, leaned my head against the window, and let her words dissolve into the hum of the engines. Outside, The sky was a soft canvas of clouds and fading light. I focused on that, letting the possibility of a new chapter, a chapter without her, ease the tension in my chest. She nudged me with her elbow, sharp enough to jolt me from my reverie. "Well, drop out, dude," she said, a wicked grin curling her lips. "Enjoy your little podcast. I'll be in first class, where people like me belong." She stood up with a huff, flipping her hair like a banner of triumph, and disappeared down the aisle in search of her luxury. I watched her go, her perfume fading like a bad memory. The seat beside me felt lighter, the air less stifling. For the first time in a long while, I let out a slow breath and realized I didn't need her approval anymore. The window framed a vast sky, endless possibilities stretching beyond the horizon. I smiled to myself. Let her fly her first-class life. I had my own flight to catch, and this time, I'd be flying solo. The flight had barely reached cruising altitude when Cambria launched into her second act, determined to make sure I felt every inch of the distance between our lives. She disappeared to first class for a while, probably ordering champagne and scoping out which millionaire or influencer she'd impress next. But now she was back, balancing her designer purse on the armrest like a trophy. Her lips curved in a smirk that was almost affectionate in its cruelty. "So, Jalen," she said, drawing out my name like a secret she couldn't wait to share, "tell me, still flying coach?" She didn't wait for an answer. Her gaze raked over my simple jeans and t-shirt like they were evidence in a trial she'd already won. I took a slow breath, reminding myself of the palm trees waiting in Maui, the ocean air that didn't care about her designer labels or her billionaire husband. I tried to imagine the sand between my toes, the sun on my face, anything but the way her voice made me feel like I was 16 again, standing outside her parents' mansion, wondering how someone like me had ever fit into her world. "Still flying, coach," I said quietly, not looking at her. "It gets me where I need to go." She laughed, a sound that was too sharp for the small cabin. Heads turned. Even the businessman across the aisle looked up from his laptop, his eyes flicking between us like he was watching a reality show unfold. Cambria leaned in, the scent of her perfume wrapping around me like a net I couldn't quite escape. "Of course it does," she said, voice dripping honey and acid in equal measure. "Meanwhile, Mike, my husband, insists on private jets. He says life's too short to settle for less." She paused, letting the words sink in like a knife between my ribs. "Can you imagine that, Jalen? Never waiting in line, never sharing armrests with strangers. Just you, a glass of Dom Perignon, and the sky." Her eyes sparkled with triumph, as if she'd just delivered the final blow. I turned to her then, my gaze steady. I wanted to tell her that I'd flown solo before more times than she could count, that I'd felt the yoke in my hands, the rush of air as the wheels left the ground, that I'd flown for reasons that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with freedom. But she wouldn't understand that. So I just nodded. "Sounds nice," I said, my voice calm, refusing to give her the reaction she craved. Her smirk wavered for a fraction of a second. It was so fast I might have imagined it. She straightened in her seat, lips pressing together like she'd tasted something sour. "You always were so easy to please," she said finally, her tone dismissive. "Guess some people just can't aim higher." She pulled out her phone then, perfectly manicured nails dancing across the screen. Probably texting Mike, or maybe some friend about the loser she'd just run into. I looked away, focusing on the clouds beyond the window. They drifted in slow, lazy shapes, oblivious to the drama playing out in the cramped cabin. The plane hummed with quiet conversations and the occasional clink of ice in plastic cups. I tried to lose myself in the white noise, but Cambria's presence pressed against me like a weight I couldn't shift. Memories crawled out from the corners of my mind. The way she used to smile at me across cheap takeout dinners, the late-night talks about dreams we hadn't even named yet, the promises we'd whispered that neither of us had kept. I'd believed every word. She'd believed in the next best thing. Maybe I'd always known that, some part of me that I'd buried under hope and pride. I closed my eyes and let the engine's rumble fill the silence between us. But it didn't last. The captain's voice crackled through the speaker, calm but urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a licensed pilot on board, please notify the crew immediately." My heart stopped. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and impossible. I opened my eyes. Cambria's smirk had vanished, replaced by something raw, uncertainty, maybe even fear. Her mouth parted, but no sound came out. She turned to me, her eyes wide. "Did they say pilot?" she asked, her voice suddenly small, the bravado slipping like a mask too heavy to hold. The flight attendant appeared in the aisle, eyes scanning the passengers. Her gaze landed on me with a kind of desperation I hadn't seen since my Air Corps days. "Sir," she said, voice trembling, "are you Jalen Rivers?" For a moment, the world felt like it was moving in slow motion. Cambria's hand shot out, gripping my arm like I was the only solid thing left. Her nails dug into my skin. "You? What are you going to do?" she demanded, her voice cracking. I stood slowly, my mind already shifting gears, the years of training kicking in like muscle memory. I could see the cockpit door at the front of the plane, closed but not locked. I knew what was waiting on the other side. Fear. Panic. Maybe worse. I turned to her, my face calm, my voice steady. "Just an old dream coming full circle," I said. Her eyes widened. She opened her mouth to argue, but I was already moving, the aisle stretching out before me like a runway. The other passengers blurred into shadows. The plane's walls seemed to breathe, alive with possibilities I hadn't felt in years. Each step felt like a reclamation, a reminder of who I'd been and who I still was. A pilot. A survivor. Someone who didn't need her approval or her insults to know his worth. As I reached the front of the plane, the flight attendant stepped aside, her eyes brimming with hope. The cockpit door loomed ahead, a challenge and an invitation. I reached for the handle, pausing for just a breath to steady myself. Behind me, Cambria's voice rose again, shaky now, stripped of its cruelty. "Jalen," she called, but I didn't turn around. Some moments are too important to waste on the past. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, ready to fly. The cockpit door shut behind me with a quiet click, but the noise inside my head was deafening. Years of training, the grind of simulations, the weight of every exam, every evaluation, every high-pressure scenario, I drilled into muscle memory. All of it surged like a tidal wave. My heart raced, but my hands were steady. I took a breath, focusing on the rows of switches, the blinking lights, the yoke that felt like an extension of my arms. This was my space, my domain. Even if I'd been forced to trade in a uniform for a simpler life, I'd never really let go of the sky. The captain lay slumped against the seat, his face pale and slick with sweat. A flight attendant hovered nearby, her face a mixture of fear and hope, hands trembling as she held a small medical kit that clearly wasn't enough. I glanced at the co-pilot. Same story. Oxygen masks hung loose, futile, and I could smell the sharp scent of antiseptic and the metallic tang of panic in the air. I nodded to the attendant. "I've got this," I said, my voice firm. She hesitated, then gave me a grateful look and ducked out of the cockpit, closing the door behind her. I slid into the captain's seat, the leather cool and familiar under my palms. Every inch of the panel in front of me was a language I spoke fluently, even after all these years. My eyes scanned the instruments, altitude holding steady, fuel levels solid, autopilot engaged, but now waiting for hands that knew what to do. I adjusted the headset, the crackle of the radio a welcome sound. "Mayday, Mayday," I began, my voice steady even though my pulse pounded. "This is Flight 482, pilot incapacitated. Licensed pilot at the controls, requesting immediate instructions." A beat of silence followed, then the calm, precise voice of an air traffic controller filled my ears. "Flight 482, roger that. State your experience and current heading." I relayed the details quickly, my Air Corps background, the certifications that hadn't expired, the thousands of hours that had built me from a raw recruit into a pilot with nerves of steel. I glanced in the reflection of the cockpit glass and caught sight of myself. The man looking back wasn't the dropout dude Cambria had loved to belittle. He was Captain Rivers again, someone who had faced live fire and come out breathing, someone who'd known what it meant to have lives in his hands and never flinched. The plane banked slightly as I adjusted the heading. A bump of turbulence rattled the cabin, and I could almost feel the collective gasp of the passengers behind me. My hands moved automatically, smoothing the yoke, making minute corrections, steadying the craft like I'd done 1,000 times before. "Flight 482. The controller's voice came again, calm but urgent. "We're vectoring you toward Maui. Can you maintain heading 270 and descend to 10,000 feet? "Affirmative," I replied, descending to 10,000. My voice was calm, steady, a stark contrast to the tight knot in my chest that wouldn't ease until those wheels kissed the ground. Every second in that cockpit felt like a lifetime. The hum of the engines, the rhythm of the instruments, the shifting shadows of clouds outside. It was a symphony I'd missed, a reminder of who I'd been before life had steered me off course. I remembered my instructor back at the Air Corps, a wiry man with a voice like gravel and eyes like steel. "Flying's a dance," he'd said. "You don't fight the plane, you lead it. You make it trust you." I whispered it to myself now, a mantra that settled the adrenaline in my veins. "Lead it," I said softly, my fingers dancing over the controls. "Make it trust you." The intercom crackled, and I hit the switch. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your acting pilot, Jalen Rivers. We've experienced a medical emergency in the cockpit. I'm a licensed pilot, and I'm in control of the aircraft. We're on course for Maui. Please remain calm and follow crew instructions." I released the switch and exhaled, hoping my voice had carried enough authority to soothe the panic I knew was rippling through the cabin like an electric current. A movement caught my eye. Cambria. She stood at the cockpit door, her face pale, eyes wide. She looked like a child lost in a storm. For the first time since our divorce, her expression was stripped of that invincible confidence. She didn't speak. She just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she'd forgotten how words worked. I held her gaze, unflinching. "It's okay," I mouthed, my voice too quiet for the headset to pick up. She blinked hard, her eyes glistening like she might actually cry. Then she nodded, a small, trembling motion, and vanished back into the cabin. For a moment, I let myself remember the nights we'd spent studying flight manuals together, sprawled on the living room floor, her head on my shoulder as I'd traced the diagrams with a pencil, explaining things she'd never cared to understand. The way she'd kissed me before my first solo flight, whispered, "Show them who you are." I had, and somewhere along the way, she'd stopped caring who that was. I felt a twinge of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by focus. Lives depended on me now, hers included. That irony wasn't lost on me. I adjusted the flaps, checked the altimeter, and listened to the rhythmic chatter of the tower guiding me in. My hands worked automatically, a practiced choreography that brought me closer to Maui's coast with each passing second. The controller's voice was steady. "Flight 482, you're cleared for approach. Wind at 12 knots from the east. Runway 8, clear." "Copy that," I replied, my voice strong. "Cleared for approach." I guided the plane lower, the ocean sparkling like glass beneath the wings. I could almost smell the salt air, feel the humidity wrapping around me like an embrace. The runway came into view, a silver ribbon of safety after the longest flight of my life. My hands were firm on the yoke. I felt the plane respond to my touch, obedient and sure. As the wheels touched down with a satisfying thud, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The brakes engaged, the engines roared down to idle, and the plane rolled to a slow, steady stop. Applause erupted behind me, a sound that felt like a warm tide washing over my battered heart. I turned to the reflection in the cockpit glass and let the smallest smile touch my lips. I wasn't a dropout. I was Captain Rivers, and I just brought 200 souls safely home. The cabin door opened. The flight attendant, tears on her cheeks, reached for my hand. "Thank you," she whispered. I just nodded, the adrenaline fading, leaving me hollow but alive. I stood, straightened my shirt, and walked back into the cabin. The passengers watched me like I'd grown wings. But it was Cambria's face I sought. She sat in her seat, eyes red, hands trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, but I just shook my head. No words were needed. I had already said everything in the sky. The cockpit door shut behind me with a soft click, but the silence was anything but comforting. The air was tense, electric, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I slid into the captain's seat, feeling the familiar texture of the controls beneath my fingers, like an old friend I hadn't seen in too long. The co-pilot's seat was empty now, the paramedics having taken him to the galley where the flight attendants were doing their best with oxygen and defibrillators. My hands moved automatically, muscle memory from my Air Corps days, flicking switches, checking instruments. Altimeter steady. Fuel tanks balanced. Autopilot engaged but loose. No human hands on the yoke for at least 10 minutes. My fingers gripped the throttle, and for a moment I closed my eyes and let the hum of the engine settle the hammering in my chest. This was my moment. The one I'd run from all those years ago when a training accident left me grounded, staring at a medical discharge that had felt like a death sentence. But even then, even as I tried to build a new life away from the clouds, the sky had never really let go of me. I'd catch myself staring up at the contrails, my hands twitching as if they could feel the stick in my grip, the wind in my hair. And now, 30,000 feet above the Pacific, fate had given me another shot. I wasn't about to waste it. Tower, This is Flight 482. I said into the headset, my voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. We've got a medical emergency in the cockpit. I'm a licensed pilot, Air Corps trained, with commercial hours logged, requesting immediate vectors for approach. There was a beat of silence, the longest second of my life, and then the tower's voice came back, steady and composed, like an old friend. Flight 482, we copy. Confirming type and experience. We'll vector you in for a priority landing at Maui International. I rattled off my credentials, muscle memory again, the words flowing out in the order they drilled into me so long ago. The tower controller paused, then came back. Understood, Flight 482. You're cleared to descend to 10,000 feet. Reduce speed to 240 knots and prepare for approach. Roger that, I said, my hands moving to the yoke, easing it forward as the altimeter began its slow, steady drop. The engines rumbled, the nose dipped, and the horizon tilted just enough to remind me how much trust these passengers were placing in a man they'd never met. I let that weight settle on my shoulders, the same way I had back in training, back when every flight felt like an exam I couldn't afford to fail. Except this wasn't training. This was real, and the lives of 200 souls were depending on me to get it right. A flicker of movement in the cabin caught my eye. Through the small window in the cockpit door, I saw Cambria's face, pale, lips pressed tight, eyes wide with a fear I'd never seen from her before. She looked like she wanted to burst through that door, to ask me a million questions, to remind me of every failure she'd cataloged during our marriage. But she stayed put, and for that I was grateful. I had no room for her games now. The clouds outside drifted past in soft, gray layers, a constant companion through the long, silent minutes that followed. I kept my hands steady, my eyes moving from instrument to horizon, back and forth in a rhythm that was as familiar as breathing. I remembered my instructor, a wiry old captain with a voice like gravel, telling me once, the key to flying, rivers, is to respect the sky. Don't fight it, dance with it. I smiled at the memory, a wry twist of my lips that almost hurt. Dance with it. I could do that. Flight 482, turn left heading 250, the tower called. I acknowledged, turning the yoke with smooth, practiced hands. The plane banked gracefully, the clouds shifting outside like slow-motion waves. The cockpit felt like a sanctuary now, a place where the noise of my failed marriage, my bruised pride, my years of working jobs that never fit, none of that mattered. Here, I was the man in charge, the man who had trained for this moment, the man who, despite everything, had never stopped being a pilot. The approach checklist ticked through my mind. Flaps, landing gear, speed brakes. My hands moved with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. It was like the cockpit had always been waiting for me to come back. The tower's voice came again, softer now, a tone I recognized from the worst nights of my training. The voice that knew it might be talking to someone for the last time. Flight 482, Maui Tower. Wind's calm. Runway 2 is clear. You're cleared for landing. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat and exhaled. Roger that, Maui Tower. Flight 482 is cleared for landing. Let's bring her home. I eased the yoke, the plane responding with the grace of a well-trained thoroughbred. The runway appeared through a break in the clouds, a thin gray line stretching out like a promise. My heart hammered once, twice, then settled. I'd done this before. In training. In combat simulations. Even in nightmares. But never like this. Never with so much on the line. The wheels kissed the tarmac, the plane shuddering as the reverse thrust roared to life. The brakes engaged, the engines wound down, and the plane slowed, coasting to a steady, rolling stop. I let my hands rest on the yoke, the adrenaline draining out of me like a tide. My eyes found the reflection in the cockpit glass, the man staring back at me with tired eyes but a steady smile. Captain Rivers. The dropout dude who never really dropped out of the sky. I could almost hear the applause from the cabin, but I didn't need it. I'd done what I was meant to do. Behind me, the cockpit door cracked open. A flight attendant peeked in, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. I nodded, my own throat tight. Outside, the runway stretched out beneath the bright Hawaiian sun, the clouds drifting above like old friends. I'd flown again. Not because I had to, but because I was born to. The wheels kissed the tarmac with a shudder that rattled the overhead bins and sent a ripple of gasps through the cabin. But I barely noticed. My hands were steady on the yoke, guiding the plane with practiced precision. The runway blurred beneath us, lines of white and black flashing by like some memory I hadn't let go of. The engines roared down to idle, the brakes engaged, and the nose dipped gently as the plane rolled to a slow, deliberate stop. For a heartbeat, the silence inside the cockpit felt like the pause between two chapters of my life, the place where one story ended and another began. Applause erupted from the cabin behind me, sudden and thunderous, a chorus of relief and gratitude that filled the space with a warmth I hadn't expected. I didn't need it. Praise had never been my fuel, but in that moment, it felt like the universe itself was telling me I'd made it back. I'd done the thing they thought I couldn't. I let out a slow breath, releasing the tension that had coiled in my shoulders since the first call crackled through the speaker. I turned my head slightly, catching my reflection in the dark glass of the cockpit, a man with tired eyes, a day's worth of stubble, but a quiet kind of triumph in the lines of his face. Captain Rivers, the dropout dude, the man who'd never stopped flying. A flight attendant tapped gently on the door, eyes bright and cheeks flushed. "We're clear," she said softly, almost reverently. "Medical team is ready. Airport security standing by." "You did it." I nodded, my voice caught somewhere between relief and exhaustion. "Thanks," I managed, but she was already moving, opening the door and stepping aside as the paramedics rushed in, their voices brisk and efficient as they attended to the captain and co-pilot. I stood slowly, my legs remembering how to bear weight, and stepped out of the cockpit into the aisle. The passengers' eyes found me instantly, some teary, some wide with awe, some just stunned that the man they'd barely noticed at the start of the flight had saved them. Bob was the first familiar face I saw, his apron still tied around his waist, flour on his cheek like he'd come straight from the kitchen. "You flew the damn plane," he roared, wrapping me in a bear hug that nearly cracked my ribs. "You legend." He laughed, but there was a catch in his voice, a note that told me he knew exactly how much that landing had cost me in sweat and memory. I clapped his shoulder, the laughter easing something tight in my chest. "Yeah," I said, my voice rough but steady. "I flew the plane." Behind him, Cambria stood frozen, her face pale, arms folded tight across her designer blouse. Her eyes were glassy, wide, the perfect mask of someone who'd just watched her carefully constructed reality shatter in real time. She tried to speak, lips parting in a silent plea I couldn't hear, but I turned my gaze away before she could form the words. I didn't need her apologies or explanations. Not anymore. A reporter in a blazer and a hastily attached press badge darted forward, microphone extended like a weapon. "Sir, is it true you're a dropout? That you were just a passenger when this happened?" I met her eyes, the heat of the Hawaiian sun behind her making her squint. I didn't flinch. "No," I said evenly, voice carrying over the hum of the engines winding down. "I'm not just a passenger. I'm Jalen Rivers. Captain Rivers. I was Air Corps. And I just brought this plane home." She hesitated, microphone drooping as my words sank in. I gave her a nod, turned my back on the questions, and stepped out onto the tarmac. The sun hit me like a blessing, hot, bright, unapologetic. I felt it soak into my skin, the salt air tangling with the engine fumes. The crowd parted, whispers trailing me like shadows. Cambria's voice followed me, soft and broken. "Is that your restaurant?" I turned to see her standing at the edge of the stairs, eyes wide with confusion. I shook my head, a small smile on my lips. "No, Cam. It's his," I said, gesturing at Bob. "I just saved the passengers." And with that, I walked away from the plane, from the past that had tried so hard to keep me grounded. The sky was still waiting, and I was still ready to fly. Inside Bob's restaurant, the air was thick with the smell of seared tuna and garlic butter, the sizzle of pans in the open kitchen mingling with the clatter of glasses and the low hum of conversation. I'd barely stepped through the door before the place erupted. Chefs in white coats, waitstaff with aprons askew, even a few tourists clutching guidebooks and half-finished cocktails. They all turned to me like I'd just walked off a movie screen. A cheer went up, sudden and unscripted, and for a moment, the sound of it made the tension in my shoulders ease, the adrenaline that had carried me through the flight finally starting to ebb. Bob was at the center of it all, arms outstretched like a proud father. "You flew the damn plane, brother," he roared, voice cracking with emotion. He grabbed me in a hug that nearly knocked the breath from my lungs, his laughter warm and bright and exactly what I needed. "You're a hero," he said, pulling back, his eyes shining. I managed to smile, though it felt a little brittle around the edges. "Just did what I had to," I said. But even as I said it, I felt the truth of it settle in my bones. I'd done it. I'd flown the plane. I brought them home. The staff swarmed around me. Waiters with notepads, sous chefs with sauce-stained aprons, even the dishwasher, still wearing his rubber gloves. They all wanted to shake my hand, to pat my back, to tell me I'd done something incredible. I let them. For a man who'd spent too many years feeling like he didn't belong, like he'd failed at everything he'd ever tried, it felt good to be seen. Even if only for a moment. Even if only for this. In the middle of the crowd, I saw him. Mike, Cambria's husband. He stood there in a crisp linen shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows, looking every bit the picture of calm wealth. Polished, polite, unassuming. His hair was perfect, his watch probably cost more than my old Honda. And yet there was something in his eyes that made me pause. Not arrogance, not judgment, something like respect. He stepped forward, extending a hand, and I took it, his grip firm and warm. "My wife told me you used to date," he said, his voice low but steady, the words carefully chosen. "Didn't expect someone so accomplished." He paused, searching my face, as if trying to make sense of the man standing in front of him. I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. "Neither did she," I said, the words tasting like a truth I hadn't spoken in years. He smiled at that, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "She said you dropped out," he continued, voice soft, like he wasn't quite sure if he should be asking. I shrugged, the motion loose and easy. "I dropped into life instead," I said, feeling the old pain recede, replaced by something lighter, freer. He laughed, and it felt genuine, like the two of us were sharing a secret that neither Cambria nor her diamond-studded world could touch. Around us, the restaurant buzzed with life, plates clinking, glasses being refilled, waiters ducking between tables with practiced grace. I could hear the kitchen crew shouting orders, the steady rhythm of knives on cutting boards, the hiss of oil in pans. It felt real. Tangible. A reminder that not everything in life came wrapped in fancy labels or price tags. Some things, like this moment, like the feeling of solid ground beneath my feet after a flight that could have ended in disaster, were priceless. Mike cleared his throat, his eyes thoughtful. "You know," he said, his voice quieter now, "she never mentioned how brave you are. Or that you could do something like that." He paused, looking down at his drink, fingers tracing the condensation on the glass. "Guess I'm learning a lot tonight." I studied him for a moment, the man who'd taken the place I used to hold. He was different from me in almost every way, but in that instant, I saw something familiar. A man who'd been blindsided by the person he thought he knew. A man who'd believed the best about her until the worst showed up unannounced. I didn't say any of that. Instead, I just nodded. "We're all learning," I said, the words carrying more weight than I intended. He looked up, eyes steady, and for the first time, I realized he wasn't the enemy I'd imagined in my head. He was just another guy trying to make sense of the mess that Cambria left in her wake. "You're a good man, Jalen," he said, voice steady. "Thank you for what you did today." He extended his hand again, and I shook it, feeling something settle between us, a quiet understanding that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the kind of men we'd chosen to be. I stepped back, letting the crowd close in around me, their voices rising like a wave. Bob clapped me on the shoulder, his grin wide and easy. "You know," he said, eyes twinkling, "you could always come work with us. We've got a spot in the kitchen, Legends pay." I laughed, the sound genuine this time. "I think I'll stick to flying," I said, the words wrapping around me like an old friend. The weight on my chest felt lighter, the air clearer. I wasn't just the dropout dude anymore. I was the man who'd flown the plane, the man who'd saved the day. And no expensive ring, no designer perfume, no carefully curated life could take that away from me. As I moved through the restaurant, people reached out to touch my hand, to thank me, to tell me their stories of fear and relief. I listened, nodding, feeling every word sink into me like a balm on an old wound. Behind every expensive ring, every carefully constructed image, there were real people, scared, grateful, human. I felt that now more than ever. And as I walked out into the warm Maui night, the stars overhead and the salt breeze on my face, I realized something. This was my sky, my life, my chance to fly again on my own terms. And nothing, no one, was going to bring me down. I couldn't sleep that night, though the island air was soft and sweet, and Bob had offered me the guest room above the restaurant. A space that smelled of basil and bread, where the ocean breeze curled around the curtains like a promise of peace. But peace was something that felt just out of reach. I lay on the small bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the day catch up with me in waves. The flight, the cockpit, the cheers in the terminal. Cambria's eyes at the end, wide and scared, the way she'd reach for me like a lifeline she didn't deserve. I rolled over, trying to let sleep take me, but my phone buzzed on the nightstand, the glow harsh in the dark. I reached for it, half expecting another update from the airline, a message from the tower, or maybe Bob asking if I needed anything. But the name on the screen made my stomach tighten. Cambria. The time read 2:14 a.m. I swiped it open, and there it was. Please don't tell Mike the truth about us. He doesn't need to know what I was like back then. I read the message twice, her words flickering like embers. The truth about us. About the way she'd treated me. The belittling. The way she traded my loyalty for status, my trust for bigger bank accounts and shinier trophies. The way she laughed when I said I wanted to fly again, told me I'd never be anything more than a dropout dude with a broken dream. I thought of Mike, with his clean-cut grin and his easy laugh. The way he'd shaken my hand and called me a good man. The way he'd thanked me in front of everyone at the restaurant, his eyes bright with gratitude and something else, relief, maybe. I pictured his face, the way he'd looked at Cambria as if she were the center of his world, and something inside me clenched. I could ruin her with 5 sentences. I could crack open the perfect shell she'd built around herself and let him see the rot beneath. It would be so easy. But easy never felt like enough. I stared at the screen, her message still there, the dots at the bottom flickering as if she were typing again. Then they vanished. I pictured her somewhere in a suite with silk sheets, or maybe in a cold hotel room with the city lights outside. I wondered if she was crying, or if her fingers trembled as she typed. But then I remembered the smirk on her face when she'd called me dropout dude. The way she dismissed my life, my choices, my dignity. I thought of the passengers on that plane, the flight attendant's tears when we'd landed, the hug from Bob that felt more real than anything I'd had with her. I remembered Mike's handshake and the way his respect had felt like a lifeline. I thought of the man I'd been in that cockpit, alone with the sky, the instruments, and the weight of 200 souls. The man who'd brought them all home. That was the man I wanted to be. Not the one who'd trade pain for vengeance. Not the one who'd answer her plea with a weapon. I typed 2 words, no worries, and hit send. My thumb hovered for a moment over the screen before I locked the phone and set it back on the nightstand. The air felt cooler now, the hum of the ocean outside soothing in its steadiness. I rolled onto my back and stared at the ceiling again, my chest feeling lighter than it had in years. The truth always finds its way home. I'd learned that the hard way. She didn't need my help to ruin her own life. She'd already sown the seeds. I wasn't her cleanup crew anymore. The clock on the nightstand ticked past 3 a.m., each minute a gentle reminder that time only moved forward. I listened to the faint sounds of the street below, waves against the sand, the distant hum of cars heading to late-night parties or early-morning fishing trips. Life, moving on, whether I watched it or not. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, the weight of old wounds finally lifting. I'd chosen my own peace, my own path. I'd chosen not to be the man who dragged someone else down just to prove a point. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges. A meeting with the airline, a statement to the press, maybe even a call from the FAA. But I'd face it all as Captain Rivers, the man who flew the plane and brought them home. Not the dropout dude. Not the ex-husband with an axe to grind. Just me, standing on my own feet, looking the world in the eye. I closed my eyes, the darkness behind my lids a welcome relief from the glow of the phone screen. I thought of the passengers clapping, of Bob's hug, of Mike's quiet gratitude. I thought of the hum of the engines and the way the plane had responded to my touch, the way it had trusted me to bring it safely down. And I knew, no matter what Cambria thought she knew about me, no matter what she told herself in the middle of the night, I was no longer the man she'd left behind. I was something more, something stronger. And as sleep finally claimed me, I felt the last piece of her grip slip away like smoke, leaving only the quiet certainty of the sky and my place in it. The morning after that message was the first time in years I felt like I'd finally stepped out from under her shadow. I woke to the gentle hush of ocean waves, a soft breeze slipping through the slatted windows of Bob's guest room, carrying the scent of salt and hibiscus. I could hear the clatter of breakfast prep in the kitchen below, Bob's crew getting ready for the day. Life was moving forward, unbothered by Cambria's games. And so was I. I stretched, rolling my shoulders to work out the tension that had settled there, a leftover from the weight of that flight and from years of carrying burdens that weren't mine to bear. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I felt a flicker of irritation, half expecting another middle-of-the-night message from her. But it was an alert from the airline, routine paperwork, a follow-up on the emergency landing, a request to debrief with the FAA. Business as usual for a man who'd done his job. I let out a breath and texted Bob to let him know I'd be down in a minute. When I got to the kitchen, he was standing at the stove, a spatula in one hand and a grin that stretched from ear to ear. "Morning, hero," he said, flipping a pancake like it was the easiest thing in the world. "Coffee's fresh. Figured you'd need it after yesterday's fiasco." I laughed, the sound lighter than I'd felt in months. "You figured right," I said, grabbing a mug and pouring myself a generous helping. I took a sip, savoring the warmth and the smooth bitterness that always felt like home. Bob watched me over his shoulder, eyes sharp but kind. "You sleep at all?" he asked. I nodded. "Eventually," I said, and he didn't press. We settled at the little table near the window, the ocean view stretching out beyond the palm trees. It was the kind of morning I'd always pictured for myself, simple, honest, free. And for once, I felt like I'd earned it. Bob leaned back in his chair, eyeing me. "You gonna call the FAA today?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "They'll want my statement. Get their boxes checked." I paused, my gaze drifting to the waves. "It's fine. I'm not hiding from that." He nodded, his smile turning serious. "And her?" he asked, voice gentle but pointed. I sighed. "Cambria's got her own mess to clean up," I said. "I'm not part of that anymore." Bob grinned, raising his coffee in a toast. "That's the spirit." I thought that would be the end of it, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. I spent the afternoon helping Bob's crew with the lunch rush, busboy 1 minute, sous chef the next, laughing with tourists and catching up with old island friends. It felt good, being useful without anyone's expectations weighing me down. By the time I wiped down the last table and stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, the sun was starting its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and coral. That's when I saw him. Mike. He stood by the outdoor bar, his posture stiff, hands shoved into his pockets, eyes lost somewhere in the middle distance. He looked thinner, the tan lines on his arms sharper, the easy smile gone. I felt a pang of something pity, maybe, or empathy. He'd been the man who'd taken my place, and now he was here, alone, carrying his own version of what I'd lived through. "Mike," I called, crossing the deck. He turned, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. "Jalen," he said, his voice rough, as if he'd been fighting to keep it steady all day. I nodded, offering a small smile. "You okay?" I asked. He laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. "She's gone," he said, and the words dropped between us like a stone. I felt the breath catch in my chest, though I shouldn't have been surprised. "Gone," I repeated. He nodded, staring at the palm trees as if they might offer an explanation. "Packed her things last night," he said. "Left a note. Said she needed time to think, needed space. I overheard her on the phone with a friend the other night. She was laughing about how easy it was to play me, about how dumb I was for believing in her." His voice cracked, and he shook his head. "I thought she loved me," he whispered. I reached out, a hand on his shoulder, the gesture solid and honest. "You're not the first," I said quietly, my voice steady. "Just be the last." He blinked at me, a tear slipping down his cheek. "How did you survive it?" he asked, his eyes searching mine like a man looking for a map out of the dark. I took a slow breath, the memories flooding back. The fights, the nights I'd spent alone with her words echoing in my head, the way I'd almost let her define me. But I'd found my way back to myself. I'd found the sky again. "You survive," I said simply. "You remember who you were before her. You remember who you are now. And you never let her take that away again." He nodded, his jaw trembling as he tried to swallow the grief. "I feel like such a fool," he whispered. I shook my head. "You loved her," I said. "That's never foolish. But she made choices. And now you get to make yours." He looked at me then, really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. "Thank you," he said, his voice stronger now. "For everything." I squeezed his shoulder, then let go. "Go find your own peace," I said. "Don't let her steal it." He left soon after, a small duffel slung over his shoulder, his posture already straighter, his eyes brighter. I watched him disappear down the beach path, the sun catching the sand and painting it gold. I stood there for a long time, feeling the ocean breeze on my face, the last rays of sunlight warming my skin. Cambria had left a mark on both of us, but it didn't have to define us. We were both free now, in our own ways. As the night crept in, I walked back toward the restaurant, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses carrying through the air. The smell of grilled fish and coconut curry wafted over the deck. I paused at the doorway, looking back at the sky clear, vast, endless. I thought of the cockpit, the feel of the yoke in my hands, the way the plane had trusted me to bring it home. I thought of the way my heart had steadied in that moment, the way the man I'd always been had stepped forward. I was no longer defined by her, or by the name she'd called me, or by the mistakes we'd made together. I was defined by the choices I'd made when the world needed me most. I was defined by the man who brought them home. And as I stepped into the warmth of the restaurant, greeted by Bob's grin and the laughter of friends, I knew one thing for sure. I was ready to live my life, my way. No more shadows. No more doubts. Just the open sky, the steady hum of engines, and the promise of new beginnings waiting just beyond the clouds. Cambria had always known how to make an exit. Even after the plane landed and the passengers were safe, she clung to her illusions like a lifeline, wrapping herself in the same brittle confidence that had carried her through every dinner party, every boutique opening, every petty triumph she'd paraded on social media. But illusions only last as long as someone's willing to believe them, and by the time Maui's pink dawn spilled across the tarmac that morning, even Cambria couldn't pretend anymore. She left Maui the way she'd arrived, quietly, with just enough drama to keep her dignity intact. A private flight out of Kahului, no press, no goodbyes. Bob had heard from a porter who'd heard from a driver that she'd moved back to her parents' place in Phoenix. The same place she'd once called temporary when she left me. This time, though, it felt final, like the last line in a song she didn't want to sing anymore. Rumor had it she was working part-time at a boutique downtown, selling expensive clothes she couldn't afford to buy herself. I thought about that sometimes. The woman who used to measure her worth in carats and brand names now standing behind a counter, ringing up customers who wouldn't know her story even if she screamed it. I'd like to say I felt sorry for her. Maybe I did, in some small, stubborn part of me that still remembered the girl who'd once been soft enough to fall asleep with her head on my chest. But that part of me had been buried under too many cold shoulders and condescending smirks. I didn't owe her my pity. Not anymore. Mike had flourished without her. He found his rhythm in the weeks that followed, booking business flights, hosting charity dinners, the kind of man who shook hands with confidence and looked people in the eye without flinching. I'd see his name pop up in local papers sometimes, always with that same easy grin and a quote about community or growth. The first time I saw a picture of him on the tarmac with a local mayor, I couldn't help but smile. He'd found his own wings, in a way. Maybe we'd both needed to crash to learn how to fly again. As for me, the calls kept coming. Airlines, news outlets, the FAA, pilots who'd heard the story and wanted to buy me a drink. Some days it felt like the whole world wanted a piece of the man who'd landed the plane. I tried to let it wash over me. Took the calls, signed the paperwork, answered the questions. But in the quiet moments, I found myself drawn back to the skies. I started spending more time at the small local airport, a single runway on the edge of town where hobbyists tinkered with old Cessnas and taught tourists how to fly. They'd look up, see me walking across the tarmac, and give me that knowing nod. The kind of respect that doesn't need applause to be real. One afternoon, I was waiting for a weather check when I saw her. Cambria, boarding another plane. She wore a dark blazer, her hair tied back in a way that was supposed to look effortless but didn't hide the tension in her shoulders. She moved like someone bracing for impact, eyes down, steps quick. I wondered if she'd seen me, if she'd felt that same tightness in her chest that I had the last time we'd locked eyes. But she didn't pause, didn't look, didn't wave. She just disappeared through the boarding door like a ghost whose haunting was finally done. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. She didn't owe me an apology, and I didn't owe her forgiveness. The past had happened. We'd both lived it. But it was over now. I turned my gaze back to the tarmac, watching a young pilot refuel a small plane, his hands sure, his posture easy. I envied him for a second, his clean start, his wide-open runway. But then I caught my reflection in the glass and saw the lines around my eyes, the steady hands that had guided a plane through the sky when no one else could. I realized that my story wasn't a cautionary tale or a footnote in someone else's biography. It was my own, and I'd written it the way I wanted, chapter by chapter, mile by mile. A week later, I signed on as an instructor at the local airfield. It wasn't glamorous, no fancy uniforms or business class lounges, but it felt right. Every morning, I'd walk the tarmac, clipboard in hand, greeting nervous students who thought they'd never get off the ground. I'd watch their eyes light up when they felt the lift for the first time, when they saw the world from above and realized they were in control. It reminded me why I'd fallen in love with flying in the first place, not for the applause, but for the freedom, for the silence of the clouds, the steady hum of the engine, the promise that anything was possible if you just had the courage to leave the ground. I never saw Cambria again after that day at the airport. Maybe she stayed in Phoenix, maybe she didn't. It didn't matter. Our paths had diverged, as they were always meant to. I didn't need her to acknowledge what I'd done or who I'd become. I'd built that for myself. And in the end, I learned that some lessons only stick when you've lived them the hard way. Somewhere over the Pacific, in the quiet moments of my own flights, I'd think of her sometimes. Not with anger or bitterness, but with a kind of detached curiosity, like you'd think of a character in a story you'd once read. She'd been part of my journey, but she wasn't the destination. And as the clouds rolled by and the ocean glinted below, I'd feel the wheel in my hands, the weight of my choices, and the steady beat of my heart telling me that this life I'd carved out for myself, was exactly where I was meant to be. Some lessons don't need repeating. Some flights are best left in the logbook. And some stories, no matter how they end, are better left with the pages turned, the chapter closed, and the horizon waiting for whatever comes next. The island mornings always started the same way. A hush of wind through the palms, a salty mist on the air, the slow glow of dawn stretching over the horizon like the soft promise of a new day. I'd taken to rising early, before the kitchen at Bob's restaurant started humming with prep, before the first tourist wandered in with sunscreen and questions. Those quiet moments were mine, uninterrupted, honest. Just the sea, the sky, and the freedom that came with them. I'd found a rhythm here that I hadn't known I needed. The small airfield just outside town had become my second home, its cracked tarmac and chain-link fences familiar and comforting. I spent hours there, training new pilots, tinkering with old planes, sharing stories of engine troubles and near misses and the thrill of liftoff. It was the kind of work that reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with the sky in the first place. Not the glory, not the headlines, just the pure, quiet wonder of flight. One morning, I was sitting in the old metal chair by the hangar, a thermos of coffee at my side, when I saw a young woman, early 20s, nerves written all over her face, walking toward me with a clipboard clutched like a shield. Her name was Lisa. She'd grown up here but had never left the ground. She wanted to be a pilot because she'd watched her dad work the sugarcane fields, always dreaming of something bigger. I recognized that look in her eyes, the hunger to prove herself, the fear that maybe she wasn't enough. I'd worn that look once too. First solo today? I asked, standing and offering a steady smile. She nodded, eyes wide, voice small. I'm not sure I can do it, she whispered. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Lisa, the hardest part of flying is trusting yourself, I said. You've trained. You know this plane. You know the sky. Trust that the work you've put in will hold you up. Her shoulders relaxed just a little, her breath catching in her throat. You really think so? She asked. I smiled. I know so. I watched from the ground as she taxied out, the little plane rolling down the runway. My heart thudded in time with the engine's roar. Then, with a graceful lift, she was airborne, and I felt that same old thrill, the rush of possibility, the wonder that never faded no matter how many times I'd watched it happen. When she landed, grinning and breathless, I was waiting. She ran to me, tears of joy in her eyes, and I clapped her on the shoulder. Welcome to the sky, I said. Those moments became the measure of my days, small victories, quiet triumphs that reminded me of who I was and why I'd chosen this life. The newspapers had moved on from the story of the man who'd landed the plane. The interviews had dried up, the reporters drifting to the next tragedy or triumph. And that was fine by me. I didn't need their validation. I had my own. Every so often, someone would mention Cambria, her name dropped casually by an old friend or a tourist who'd followed the headlines. I'd nod politely, let the words roll off me like rain. I didn't carry her shadow anymore. She'd left her mark, but I'd chosen not to let it define me. The man she'd once called dropout dude had become the man who taught others to fly. The man who landed the plane. The man who lived his own story. Sometimes, at the end of a long day, I'd walk to the edge of the airfield, where the tarmac met the sea. I'd stand there as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the water in molten gold, and think about how far I'd come. I'd remember that day on the plane, the way Cambria's voice had cut through me, the way the cabin had felt like a prison, the way the cockpit had felt like home. I'd think about the way the yoke had fit my hands, the way the sky had trusted me to bring them home. And I'd smile, knowing I'd chosen to keep flying when it would have been easier to quit. Success, they say, is the best revenge. But I'd learned that wasn't true. Peace in knowing who you are, what you've overcome, and where you're headed. Peace in knowing that the shadows you used to fear no longer hold you down. I'd found that peace here, in the steady hum of engines and the laughter of students in the endless, open sky. One evening, as the last plane of the day rolled to a stop, Lisa ran up to me, breathless, her eyes alight. "I did it," she exclaimed. "Solo cross-country. I couldn't have done it without you, Jalen." I felt something settle in my chest, pride, maybe, or a quiet kind of joy. "You did it," I said. "I just reminded you that you could." She hugged me, quick and fierce, then dashed off to call her dad. I watched her go, the wind lifting her hair, the sky overhead a deep, star-swept blue. I turned my gaze upward, the clouds shifting like old friends, the horizon wide and welcoming. I thought about all the miles I'd flown, the mistakes I'd made, the lessons I'd learned. I thought about the man I'd become, the life I'd built. And I knew this was my sky, my story, my peace. I didn't need Cambria's approval, or anyone else's. I'd earned my place in the world, and no one could take that from me. I was never the dropout dude. I was the man who never stopped flying.